The first thing my oldest brother said after our father's funeral wasn't, "Are you okay?" Or "Dad would have been proud of you." It was, "You can take the photo boxes from the garage since that's apparently all he left you." He said it loudly enough for the entire reception hall to hear, smiling into his whiskey glass while my younger brother laughed beside him like they'd rehearsed it in advance. I remember staring at the black dress shoes I'd bought on clearance 3 years earlier, because I suddenly couldn't trust my face not to betray me. Dad had spent 8 months in hospice, and during almost every night shift, he asked for me instead of them. I handled his medications, his insurance calls, the nurses, the oxygen deliveries, all while my brothers posted filtered hospital selfies twice a month pretending to be devoted sons. Still, I stayed quiet when they took the front row at the service and accepted condolences like grieving executives managing a public image crisis. But 47 minutes into the reception, just after my oldest brother announced they'd be handling the estate privately, the ballroom doors opened again. And the man walking toward our table was Dad's bank manager carrying a leather document case with my name on it. My father spent 32 years building a regional construction company that most people in Charleston only recognized by the faded blue trucks parked near half the city's waterfront developments, but inside our family, his success created a hierarchy everyone quietly obeyed. My brothers, Ethan and Mark, were treated like heirs long before Dad ever got sick, while I became the dependable daughter people called when something unpleasant needed handling discreetly. By the time Dad's pancreatic cancer reached stage 4 in January, Ethan was too busy, expanding his real estate office in Miami, and Mark kept claiming travel issues from Denver whenever hospice emergencies happened after midnight. I stopped correcting people who praised them for holding the family together, because Dad noticed everything anyway. He noticed who refilled his prescriptions, who stayed during the nights he couldn't breathe without panicking, who sat beside him while he sorted old photographs into labeled envelopes with trembling hands he tried to hide from me. 3 nights before he died, he asked me to promise something strange. He squeezed my wrist weakly and whispered, "When they start performing after the funeral, don't interrupt them." At the time I thought he meant their fake grief. I didn't realize he already knew exactly what my brothers were planning. The funeral reception was being held at the Charleston Harbor Ballroom because Ethan insisted Dad would have wanted something respectable, which was interesting considering he argued for weeks about splitting the catering bill evenly after contributing almost nothing to Dad's actual care. By 6:30 that evening, the room smelled like expensive cologne, candle wax, and cold seafood trays nobody was touching anymore, while distant jazz music echoed awkwardly through conversations about inheritance people pretended not to be having. I stayed near the back wall beside Dad's old accountant, Richard Hale, who kept giving me sympathetic looks every time Ethan made another performative speech about protecting Dad's legacy. My younger brother Mark had already loosened his tie and started telling relatives that Dad's company would probably be sold within the year because running construction isn't really something Claire understands. I heard him say it twice, the second time directly beside me. Still I said nothing. That seemed to bother them more than if I'd argued. Ethan finally approached me near the dessert table holding a bourbon glass and an expression I recognized from every family holiday growing up, the look he wore whenever he wanted an audience. "You know," he said casually, loud enough for nearby cousins to hear, "Dad always worried you were too emotional to deal with business stuff after he passed." I looked at him for a second before answering quietly, "That's interesting. He never said that to me." His smile tightened almost instantly. Mark stepped in beside him with that familiar smugness people develop when they mistake cruelty for confidence. "Come on, Claire," he said. "Nobody's trying to hurt your feelings. We're just being realistic." Then Ethan added the sentence that changed the energy at the entire table. "Dad left you sentimental things because that's what mattered to you. The photo boxes, Mom's jewelry, personal items." Behind them, I noticed 2 of Dad's former employees suddenly stop talking. Even Richard looked uncomfortable. Ethan kept going anyway. "The company, accounts, properties, those responsibilities are different." I remember staring at the condensation sliding down his whiskey glass while something cold settled into my chest. Not anger. Recognition. They had already decided this performance would work because it always had before. Public confidence. Quiet humiliation. Repeat until nobody questioned them. But Dad had spent months watching them carefully from a hospice bed, while they underestimated him too. At exactly 6:47 p.m., The ballroom doors opened again. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped inside carrying a black leather document portfolio. I recognized him immediately. Daniel Mercer, Senior Private Banking Manager at First Atlantic Trust. Ethan recognized him too because his posture changed the second he saw him walking toward our table. Daniel didn't smile at either of my brothers. Instead, he walked directly past them and stopped beside me. "Miss Bennett," he said calmly, extending a hand. "I apologize for interrupting your evening, but your father instructed me personally to deliver these documents into your possession tonight." The room became unnaturally quiet. Ethan laughed once under his breath like he expected a harmless explanation. "What documents?" he asked. Daniel turned toward him politely but didn't offer the case. "Confidential estate transfer confirmations," he replied, "as well as executive succession paperwork authorized 31 days before Mr. Bennett's passing." I watched the color drain slowly from Mark's face. Ethan recovered faster. "There's probably some misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "I'm the oldest son." Daniel nodded once. "Yes, sir. Your father clarified the family structure extensively during our meetings." That word, clarified, landed like broken glass across the table. Then Daniel opened the portfolio, removed a sealed envelope, and handed it directly to me in front of everyone. My name was written across the front in Dad's handwriting, and beneath it, in smaller letters, was a sentence that made my pulse slow completely down. "For the only person who stayed." Nobody at the table moved for several seconds after I read the envelope because the silence itself had become part of the humiliation. Ethan's expression shifted first, not into panic yet, but into the controlled irritation of someone realizing a conversation is no longer following the script he prepared. Mark looked worse. He kept adjusting his loosened tie and glancing around the ballroom to see who had overheard Daniel Mercer's comments, which was almost everyone nearby by that point. Dad's former project managers had stopped pretending not to watch. Even my Aunt Linda slowly lowered her wine glass without taking a sip. Daniel remained standing beside me with the calm professionalism of someone who had already seen wealthy families collapse in hotel conference rooms before. "Claire," Ethan said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "maybe we should handle this privately." It was the first time all evening he had used my name gently. I looked at him, then at the unopened documents in my lap. "You seemed comfortable discussing Dad's decisions publicly 10 minutes ago," I replied quietly. A few people nearby immediately looked down to hide their reactions. Mark exhaled sharply. "Seriously? You're going to make this into a scene?" I almost laughed at that because the scene had started long before Daniel arrived. They just assumed I would keep absorbing it silently the way I always had. Daniel cleared his throat softly before speaking again. "There are several signatures requiring acknowledgement tonight, Ms. Bennett. Your father was very specific about timing." Ethan stepped forward instantly. "Specific about what timing?" Daniel looked at him evenly. "The transfer of voting control before tomorrow morning's emergency board meeting." The air around the table changed completely after that sentence. My brothers both froze because Dad's construction company wasn't just family money anymore. It controlled active waterfront contracts worth nearly $80 million, including a redevelopment project Ethan had been publicly bragging about for weeks. Mark spoke first this time, and his voice cracked slightly despite his effort to sound composed. "Dad never said anything about transferring control." Daniel reached calmly into the portfolio again and removed a folded document with First Atlantic Trust letterhead. "Actually, sir, your father documented his intentions during 3 separate meetings in March and April." He slid the paper toward me first. "You were appointed acting executive chairwoman 6 weeks ago." I heard someone near the bar whisper, "Jesus Christ." Ethan immediately grabbed the edge of the table hard enough for his glass to tip sideways. Amber liquid spread slowly across the white tablecloth while he stared at me like he was trying to solve a math problem under pressure. "This is insane," he said. "Claire doesn't even work." In that ballroom news was that Dad called me 2 days later and asked me not to fight back publicly yet. "Let them get comfortable," he told me quietly over the phone while oxygen machines hummed behind him. At the time I thought he meant emotionally. Now I realized he meant legally. Daniel handed me another document. This one contained account authorizations, property trusts and executive succession records signed by Dad, witnessed by attorneys and stamped 3 separate times. Near the bottom was a handwritten note from him dated April 14th. Claire understands the business because Claire understands people. The brothers only understand ownership. Mark suddenly pulled out his phone and walked several feet away toward the ballroom windows. 30 seconds later, I heard him hissing aggressively into the receiver. "Call David right now. I don't care if it's after hours." Ethan stayed at the table, but his entire demeanor had changed. The confidence was gone now. In its place was calculation. He leaned closer toward me and lowered his voice carefully. "What exactly did Dad promise you?" I met his eyes for the first time all night without looking away. "Apparently," I said softly, "everything you thought he'd never trust me with." By 7:25 p.m., the funeral reception no longer felt like a memorial. It felt like the opening minutes of a corporate collapse happening in formal wear. Clusters of relatives had separated into nervous little circles around the ballroom, while Bennett Coastal employees quietly checked their phones after word about the emergency board meeting started spreading. Ethan disappeared twice to take calls near the lobby elevators, each time returning paler and more aggressive than before, while Mark remained near the windows arguing with someone named David, who I eventually realized was their attorney. Daniel Mercer stayed beside me almost the entire time, occasionally reviewing documents with the calm efficiency of a man who had spent decades watching entitlement unravel under fluorescent lighting. At 7:41 p.m., my cousin Rebecca approached carefully and whispered, "Claire, is it true Dad changed the company ownership?" Before I could answer, Ethan interrupted from across the table. "Nobody knows what's true yet." But his voice carried the sharp edge of panic now, and people noticed. Daniel noticed too. He opened another folder from the portfolio and removed a sealed packet marked Executive Directive, effective upon death notification. "Actually," he said evenly, "certain matters are already legally active." The room went silent again. Ethan stared directly at him. "What matters?" Daniel looked at me first before continuing. "Your father authorized a complete internal audit of Bennett Coastal's financial operations beginning immediately after his passing." Mark stopped moving entirely. Even from across the ballroom, I saw his hand tighten around his phone. Ethan recovered first. "That's standard," he said too quickly. "Every major estate does that." Daniel's expression never changed. "This audit specifically references unauthorized property leverage agreements and undocumented contractor transfers." I watched the blood drain slowly from Ethan's face this time. Not confusion. Recognition. Dad knew. Or at least suspected enough to leave instructions. Suddenly, 3 different moments from hospice clicked together in my mind at once. Ethan refusing to discuss certain company accounts in front of Dad, Mark panicking after receiving late-night banking notifications in February, and Dad asking me one strange question 2 weeks before he died. If you discovered people were borrowing against something that wasn't theirs, would you protect the company or the family? At the time, I thought the medication was making him ramble. Now my stomach tightened. Mark walked back toward the table so fast he nearly collided with a server carrying champagne glasses. "Dad was sick," he snapped suddenly. "He was on morphine half the time. You can't seriously claim these decisions weren't manipulated." Several people nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks immediately because even suggesting manipulation during a funeral reception sounded ugly. But Ethan didn't stop him. That told me everything. Daniel folded his hands calmly. All documentation was verified by independent counsel, 2 medical evaluations, and recorded witness testimony. Then he added one final sentence that shattered whatever control my brothers still thought they had. "Your father anticipated challenges from family members and prepared accordingly." Ethan looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen before. Fear disguised as anger. "You knew about this?" he asked quietly. "No," I answered honestly. "Dad just told me not to interrupt the performance." Daniel glanced at me briefly after I said it, almost like he finally understood something. Mark suddenly slammed his palm against the edge of the table hard enough to rattle silverware. "This is unbelievable," he hissed. She sat there pretending to be helpless while Dad handed her the entire company. That accusation would have hurt me years earlier. Tonight it almost sounded pathetic. I looked at him calmly. "No, Mark. I sat there while both of you spent months assuming kindness meant weakness. Ethan's phone rang again at that exact moment. He answered immediately, listened for less than 10 seconds, then went completely still. "What do you mean frozen?" he asked quietly. The ballroom noise around us faded into a blur while I watched his face collapse in real time. "Since when?" Another pause. Then softer now. "How many accounts?" When he lowered the phone, he looked older somehow. Smaller. Daniel didn't even glance up from the documents when he explained. As part of the audit protections, several executive financial privileges were temporarily suspended at 7:30 p.m. Ethan stared directly at me across the table. And for the first time in our entire lives, he realized he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. At 8:03 p.m., half the ballroom was pretending not to stare at our table, while the other half openly watched like they'd paid for tickets. The jazz quartet near the stage had quietly stopped playing 20 minutes earlier, and the reception staff moved carefully around the room with the cautious body language people use near public disasters. Ethan sat rigidly in his chair, scrolling through frozen banking apps with shaking fingers he kept trying to hide beneath the tablecloth, while Mark paced near the harbor windows, whispering furious threats into his phone about injunctions, probate delays, and temporary insanity claims. None of it mattered anymore. Dad had anticipated every move. Daniel Mercer finally handed me the last folder from the leather portfolio and said, "There's one final instruction your father asked to be delivered privately, though he indicated you could share it if necessary." I opened the folder slowly while Ethan watched me with exhausted hostility. Inside was a single typed letter dated 11 days before Dad died. The first line alone almost stopped my breathing. "Claire, if they're angry tonight, it means they finally understand I was paying attention." Beneath it were 6 pages detailing everything Dad had discovered during his final months. Unauthorized loans Ethan leveraged against pending harbor contracts, contractor kickback payments routed through one of Mark's side companies in Denver, and internal complaints from 2 female employees Ethan pressured into resigning quietly after threatening their promotions. Dad hadn't just changed the inheritance. He had built a controlled demolition plan. Attached behind the letter sat copies of compliance reports already forwarded to Bennett Coastal's outside legal counsel and board members at exactly 7 p.m. that evening. My brothers were never walking into tomorrow's emergency board meeting as executives. They were walking in as liabilities. Ethan must have recognized the documents from my expression because he stood abruptly enough to knock over his chair. "Claire," he said sharply, lowering his voice once he realized everyone was listening again, "we need to talk alone." For the first time all night, I saw desperation replacing ego completely. Mark walked back toward us seconds later looking equally destroyed. "David says if this reaches the press, we're finished." Daniel calmly corrected him. "Mr. Bennett, portions already reached the board 49 minutes ago." Mark actually closed his eyes after hearing that. Ethan turned toward me again, this time speaking carefully like someone approaching unstable explosives. "Dad was emotional near the end. You know that." He wasn't thinking clearly about family consequences. I looked at him for several seconds before answering because I wanted him to hear every word without confusion. "No," I said quietly. He was finally seeing them clearly. The silence afterward felt heavier than any argument could have. Around us, conversations had completely died. Even distant relatives across the ballroom were openly watching now. Public humiliation had finally arrived. Not loud, not theatrical, but cold and irreversible. Ethan swallowed hard before trying one last strategy. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "We can still fix this privately." That sentence almost fascinated me because it revealed the only thing he truly feared. Exposure. Not guilt. Not grief. Exposure. I folded Dad's letter carefully and placed it back inside the folder before standing for the first time since Daniel arrived. Ethan instinctively stepped backward. So did Mark. "You both spent years confusing silence with surrender," I told them calmly. Dad just happened to notice the difference before anyone else did. Then I picked up my coat, thanked Daniel for delivering the documents personally, and started toward the ballroom exit while dozens of people watched my brother sitting alone at the table Dad used to control. Just before I reached the doors, Richard Hale, Dad's accountant for 26 years, spoke loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Your father would have been proud of how you handled tonight, Claire." I turned slightly, glanced once at my brothers, and realized something almost unsettling in its simplicity. Dad hadn't left me revenge. He left me evidence. And somehow that was far more devastating. 3 months later, Bennett Coastal announced a complete executive restructuring during a press conference. Ethan and Mark were legally prohibited from attending. The internal audit uncovered enough financial misconduct to trigger civil investigations, 2 contractor lawsuits, and a federal review tied to the harbor redevelopment project Ethan once bragged about at family dinners like it already belonged to him. Mark quietly sold his Denver property before the board froze additional assets, and for the first time in years, neither of my brothers answered calls from relatives asking for the full story. Meanwhile, I moved into Dad's old corner office overlooking the marina he loved, though I kept one thing exactly where he left it: the photograph boxes stacked beside the bookshelf near the window. Turns out he was right to leave them with me. Inside those boxes were 30 years of handwritten notes, project sketches, employee birthdays, and every reminder that real legacy was never about ownership alone. It was about who showed up when nobody was watching. Last week, Richard Hale stopped by my office after a board meeting and smiled before saying, "Your father knew exactly what he was doing. I think he did too. If you've ever stayed quiet while people underestimated you, subscribe. Because some stories deserve to be heard all the way to the end."